Thanks, everybody. Great audience. Very mixed. I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards because I know actually metal fans are a lot more versed in the apocalypse than you would actually, suspect. So I put together like a presentation to kind of walk through a number of issues that I find very interesting and I would like to talk to you about today. And really, the first question, why? Why would you study, why would anybody want to study these narratives of doom, death, and destruction? I was trained as a film scholar, and when I started to work on my dissertation, I was asked to look at the interaction between Bible and film, and in particular, how particular biblical images and stories are sort of recycled and translated into a new context, a secular context of Hollywood film. So what I did was I examined to what extent representations of the apocalypse are informed by traditional notions of the biblical apocalyptic. More importantly, though, what I find very interesting is how traditional ideas and images are transformed and redirected in the process of transmission in cinema. And what I would argue, and what I would like to show you today, is that Hollywood cinema can be regarded as a site of reinterpretation of Christian and non-Christian visual and discursive traditions. However, these sort of imagery and these narratives are performed, as we say, in a non-religious medium, Hollywood. If you would ask me, why would you want to study the apocalypse, or why is it important that we are aware of the influence of biblical apocalypse, I would give you a very short answer to that, which would be, we study these narratives, we are fascinated by these images because they provide meaning for us in a very complex society, and they also give us meaning in a very simple way. They kind of provide some sort of structure in our lives, which can be sometimes characterized as chaotic. And so in that sense, the apocalypse can give us some kind of sense of structure. As a scholar, the first thing that you have to kind of look at when you're starting on this particular topic is a definition. That's not all that simple. The biblical religious origin of the apocalypse, with a capital A, refers to the book of Revelation, which is the final book in the New Testament. This particular Bible book tells the tale of the end. It is also called, mostly in American religion, the Apocalypse of John. And generally, biblical scholars will say that this is a scenario of God's final judgment on humanity. Apocalypse literally means a revelation, and it means to uncover something or to take the lid off. So it's a revealing instant. And actually, if you read the Bible, and you read this particular Bible book, you'll find that in it, this guy named John receives certain visions, and God kind of reveals to him the path towards final judgment. Revelation is not the only apocalyptical book in the Bible. There are other examples, particularly in the Old Testament, particularly like a book like Daniel or Ezra, for those of you who are more familiar with the Bible. They also contain stories of God's judgment. So if you ask a biblical scholar, what is the apocalypse, he or she will tell you, well, there are a number of books in the Bible, and from that we can kind of say that there is a biblical genre of the apocalypse. Now, I use that as a starting point, even though I myself, I am not professionally trained as a biblical scholar. I'm a film scholar. But I used those stories and those images in order to say something about what happens in popular culture. But let's just take a little step back, because I am not just talking about the Bible today, but I'm also talking about how these apocalyptic ideas are still very pervasive in modern day society. In a popular conception, the apocalypse is very often called doomsday. This may be a term that you're more familiar with. The picture that I put on the slide for you is very recent. It was, I think, about 6 or 8 weeks ago when we saw this picture, and it actually, I think it made the Dutch news. It shows the most recent presentation of the Doomsday Clock, presented by this organization called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they're like an independent non-profit organization which assesses scientific advancements that involve both benefits and risks to humanity. And when they were presenting their latest update of this particular Doomsday Clock, they stated it is now 2.5 minutes to midnight, which is an interesting idea. It means that this organization basically looked at the world's events and said, right now we are at a particularly dangerous moment in time. And they state, for the last 2 years, the minute hand of the Doomsday Clock stayed set at 3 minutes before the hour, the closest it had been to midnight since the early 1980s. But they continue and they say, the probability of global catastrophe is very high, and the actions needed to reduce the risks of disaster must be taken very soon. In 2017, we find the danger to be even greater, the need for action more urgent. It is 2.5 minutes to midnight. The clock is ticking, global danger looms, wise public officials should act immediately, guiding humanity away from the brink. So this was their official statement while they were unveiling their latest update on the clock. I'll get to why we are at such a dangerous moment in history in a minute. So from the biblical to this popular conception, you can say that the apocalyptic as a genre, as a concept, as a way to make sense of the world is very much alive in our culture today. The theme of the end is not just relevant within a religious context. I will try to sort of emphasize this point because it holds relevance for a wider audience, not just those who are interested in studying the Bible. And I think the most recent, at least, and perhaps the best example of apocalyptic thinking in recent popular culture is exemplified in the election of a certain American president. Especially in America, we see an obsession with the apocalypse. And it is so important in that culture that I basically have coined it American apocalypticism. It is a way to look at the events in the world. And there's a particular a professor of folklore and myth who has studied the American obsession with the apocalypse. And he states that actually from the inception, at the start of the United States, this nation has regarded itself as like the new Eden, which is a biblical term as well, which means that this was a country that is founded on the principle that America could make right what all the other earlier European nations did wrong. When the Puritans went to America, they started a new nation, and the idea is that they set the example for a better new Eden, a new paradise. This idea, of course, becomes difficult to maintain in a public opinion if you look at the most recent events. If you go on the internet, which I did, of course, because on the internet you'll find the most interesting examples of everything. You can see a perfect example of what this professor of folklore and mythology is talking about. Here we see American apocalypse in its most pure form. What we see here is that with a new event in history, and in this case the election of a new president, the apocalyptic mindset starts to work. And here people are generally very concerned, to the point where they are looking back at those narratives in the Bible and they are basically saying, wait, this guy who was just, elected, maybe we should read his presidency in larger apocalyptic terms, meaning he could be the person that is actually going to be responsible for the apocalypse coming about. So here they make him an agent of a possible destruction of the earth. And maybe this is interesting for those of you who are familiar with the metal kind of iconography stuff. Trump is often compared to the Antichrist, which is some figure that some of you may be familiar with. A character in the larger story who is supposedly the instrument to sort of make huge changes, and as such will also be responsible for the end of the world. So this picture, to me, is a perfect condensation of apocalyptic thinking as a way to look at our current world and our current state of affairs. But I am mostly interested in fiction and not politics. So for the remainder of the presentation, I will look at Hollywood apocalypse, because that's my specialization. To give you sort of an idea of what apocalypse looks like in Hollywood cinema, there's this guy on YouTube who made a brilliant 7-minute montage of a whole bunch of apocalyptic films. I'm not going to show you the full 7 minutes, but I'll just give you about 2.5 minutes to give you some idea what this may look like. stop here because I'm not going to talk about zombies, which is the next section in the montage. You can ask me about it, but I'm not an expert on zombies. So obviously, iconography is pretty obvious here. We see scenes of mass destruction through fire, some kind of extraterrestrial planet or water. Those are very common scenarios for the end of time. But what is interesting is if you look at a whole bunch of these films, is that although they very often are proclaiming that the end is going to happen, what happens is that the end does not happen. So what you see is actually the world is going to be saved at the very last minute by a very brave human being, most of the time a male action hero like Bruce Willis or Arnold Schwarzenegger. You save the world just in time. That's your Hollywood version of this particular narrative, contrary to the biblical one where God basically says, this is what you guys have coming to you. It's the end. There's no way you can stop it. So Hollywood gives it its own little twist. But if we think about how these narratives sort of give meaning to us in our very chaotic and difficult existence, let's take a step back and let's think about how narrative gives meaning and how apocalyptic narrative gives meaning to our sense of being, and how do we as human beings make sense of the world that we live in. One way of looking at it, which is very apocalyptic in itself, is to state that perhaps the end has already happened or is an illusion altogether. And this is one of the crucial teachings, or maybe you would say like dogmas, in French postmodern philosophy. So you can state maybe the end has already happened and we are already somewhere beyond this. Now this is of course very abstract and very postmodern, but it does influence a lot of scholarly thinking about the sense of structure and the sense of organizing time and the sense of how do we see ourselves in the larger construct of history. So perhaps we've already moved beyond it. Could be. You could agree with him or not. I don't entirely agree with him, but his notions, it's mostly Baudrillard, it's very interesting. But let's move on to one that may be more practical. How do we look at narrative and how do we see the end in narrative? And similar to what postmodern philosophy states, narrative, the stories that we tell each other and the stories that we make up of our life's events also give us meaning and structure in our lives. One of the things that you can think about if you look at the ending in a narrative is that what we try to do, there's this basic human need, is that we try to make sense of the world by sort of trying to find where did it begin, where are we now, and where is it going to end. So what we're trying to do all the time is we're trying to make a coherent story, tracing a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So if you look at it in this sense, and this has been proposed by a very famous literary scholar already in the 1960s, Frank Kermode, who wrote The Sense of an Ending. How do we make sense of our chaotic existence? He says, if we try to imagine an end of the world, the apocalyptic discourse imposes a coherent pattern on history. And what we can do with these patterns is we can actually make sense of things. So we can make what he calls a satisfying consonance with the origins and the middle. It is one of the crucial ways to make sense of the world. The human need for an imagined future, an apocalyptic future, often results in trying to calculate when this future, when this end may come to pass. does it happen? I mean, I'm sure you wonder, are we actually as close to the end as some people presume we are? I would say no. If you study apocalyptic thinking, and if you study the idea of where we are in a larger narrative, you can see throughout the last 2 centuries, people have tried to sort of figure out, are we reaching the end? The answer is no. So this may come not so much maybe as a surprise, but maybe it's at least like a comforting idea that even though we may think we're pretty close to the end, history proves us wrong in that sense. Despite numerous calculations by numerous people over the years, the end hardly ever comes to pass. This is, again, something that Hollywood cinema takes up and plays with and gives us new images to work with. So let's have a look at one particular film which, contrary to what I've been telling you before, actually gives us a full apocalyptic ending. I've chosen one particular example because I feel that what you just saw were all these Hollywood blockbuster action type films. Very particular set of narratives, very particular set of recurring images. But there are other examples which give us another way of looking at the apocalyptic, and they actually give us the apocalypse. They make a complete representation of what the end is going to look like. Initially, I picked 2 examples, but for being a bit more to the point, I skipped one, and I would like to show you the final scene of the next movie. I'm not sure if some of you have actually seen this film. Are there people here who have seen this movie? A couple, good. This is definitely a non-Hollywood film, despite the fact that some of the actors in it are well known. And it has, as such, a non-Hollywood ending. Also, it's interesting because it does not belong to this blockbuster apocalyptic narrative genre. Lars von Trier's Melancholia, which was released in 2011, does not initially look like a movie about the apocalypse. It's basically a very long, slow movie on the relationship between 2 sisters. That's exactly what he wants us to feel, and that's how we enter the narrative. One of the sisters is played by Kirsten Dunst, and she is severely depressed. She is not in a good place. She's very, very depressed. Her dealing with depression takes about 2/3 of the film. Then, all of a sudden, not exactly, but as another, happening in the narrative, there appears this planet, which is called Melancholia, coming from outer space, entering the Earth's solar system. So wait, we have a story about depression, but at the same time, the Earth is threatened by a huge, like a blue planet, which is on a collision course. Now that, to me, sounds a bit more apocalyptic. But that's not really all that important. We get a lot of stuff on their relationship, but not so much on that planet. Only in the last third of the movie, we actually feel the threat that the Earth may or may not end, and that it may be destroyed. I already said the protagonist suffers from depression, so some people have actually interpreted this movie as a study or as a metaphor on depression. I think that's very interesting, because it also shows you that the desire to make the world end can also be sort of connected to the desire to escape a certain state of being, in this case depression, which is of course a disease. I mean, and it's a very, very serious one. So what happens here is we get to the end of the movie, and rather than trying to stop this planet from colliding with Earth, the characters are basically either committing suicide or they die already, and we are left in the end with the two sisters and her child. And they are going to await the apocalypse. They're not going to try and stop it. That's impossible. So here we have an example of a film that fully, completely embraces the fact that the end will come. It's inevitable. So I wanted to show you the final scene, and it's about 3 minutes, so it's kind of long. But it kind of shows you, I think, how to deal with inevitable apocalypse, how to respond to it. And also, what's also interesting is that this implosion of melancholia with Earth is shown in a way that is not conforming to the stereotypical Hollywood iconography. And what I find particularly interesting, and this is something that we can talk about after the presentation, is how do these characters respond to the end. So I'm going to show you the final scene of the movie. I would urge you, by the way, to watch the whole film because it's a beautiful film.
Close your eyes.
And this is how the film ends. So, as a starting point for a discussion or for your questions or your remarks, how do we respond to this? What should we take as our position regarding a possible end? Should we follow Hollywood and frantically try and stop it and run for it? Or should we, like the main character in Melancholia, embrace it and await for it? And welcome it, if you will. Something to think about. Thank you.